The first letter showed up 3 weeks after I finished the bridge, and honestly, if I'd known that a crisp, cream-colored envelope with a gold-embossed return address was going to be the start of a year-long war, I probably would have burned it right there at the mailbox without even looking inside. It said in quote, Blackwood Estates HOA, Infrastructure and Compliance Division, end quote, which was the first red flag because, as far as I knew, this so-called division didn't even exist when I bought my cabin. I opened it with greasy fingers, still wearing my heavy welding gloves because I just finished reinforcing the last set of steel beams under my new hybrid bridge. The one I'd spent 6 straight weekends sweating over, paying for out of my own pocket, and losing sleep over. And inside was a bill for $8,420 for, end quote, shared bridge maintenance and structural community upgrades, end quote. I just stood there in my kitchen, blinking at the paper, and then I started laughing, but it wasn't in Oppo's. A happy laugh. It was that kind of low, disbelief-filled chuckle you get when you realize someone is trying to rob you while looking you right in the eye. See, I bought this place at the edge of the river specifically to get away from people and their drama. And while my land technically sits inside the Blackwood boundary, I'm so far out on the fringe that the HOA usually forgets I exist. The original access road washed out years ago during a bad spring thaw. And for 2 years, I had to hike in or use a quad. So I finally decided to build my own way across the creek. Not a single soul helped me. Not a dime of HOA money touched those beams. And I even pulled the permits myself after the county clerk asked me if I was crazy for doing a loan. Yet here they were, acting like I owed them for the privilege of my own hard work. The next morning, I drove down to the HOA office, which is this beige, stucco monstrosity sitting right next to a manicured golf course, trying so hard to look like a gated community in the Hamptons instead of a development in the middle of the woods. The second I stepped inside, I felt the air conditioning hit my face and saw her, Evelyn Vance, the HOA president and self-appointed queen of Blackwood Estates. She was sitting behind a mahogany desk, wearing one of those pastel sweater vests that looks like it's made of weaponized politeness, and her hair was sprayed into a rigid helmet that didn't end Oppo's. Move even when she looked up with that fake, sugary smile. End quote. Well, Mr. Silas Thorne, end quote. She said, flipping through a manila folder with my name on the tab like she'd been waiting for me to walk through the door, end quote. We were wondering when you drop by to discuss your contribution to the community's safety, end quote. I didn't in Oppo's. Sit down. I just leaned over the counter and dropped that bill right in front of her, telling her to cut the dramatic crap and explain why they were sending me a bill for a bridge I built myself. Evelyn didn't in Oppo's even blink. She just leaned back, folded her hands, and told me that because the bridge connects directly to what the board has designated as an, end quote, emergency access route, end quote, it qualifies as shared infrastructure under Article 14 of the bylaws. I told her there was no bridge there until I put one there, and it doesn't in Oppo's connect to any HOA road. It connect to my cabin and my cabin only. But she just gave me this look of pity like I was a child who didn't and Oppo's understand how the world worked. End quote. Our legal team has already reviewed the layout, Silas, end quote. She whispered, end quote. And if you want to contest the invoice, you'll need to submit a Form 22B with a $50 processing fee. But I'd advise against it because we're all part of a collective here, even the Oppo's. Rugged and Oppo's. Types who think they can live outside the rules, end quote. I walked out of there before I said something that would get me arrested, but as I drove back to the river, the gears were already turning because something about the way she said, end quote, emergency access route, end quote, felt oily. I spent the next 3 nights buried in old county zoning maps, property deeds, and the original HOA charter from 30 years ago, and that's when I found the first crack in her story. Evelyn was lying through her teeth. My bridge sat entirely on my private parcel. And that, end quote, emergency route, end quote, she kept talking about was nothing but a ghost trail on a map that had been rejected by the county back in the 90s. They weren't in Oppo's trying to maintain a road. They were trying to steal my bridge because they'd mismanaged their own budget and needed a way to claim my private infrastructure as a community asset to drive up property values for the houses near the golf course. I decided to play it quiet for a few days, but then I noticed fresh boot prints near my tool shed and some brush cleared away near the bridge's north support. So I tucked a high-def trail camera under the cedar railings, hidden by some decorative ivy. 2 nights later, I'm sitting on my porch with a cup of black coffee, scrolling through the footage on my laptop, and I nearly choked when I saw a guy in a reflective vest creeping across my bridge at 3 a.m. with a power drill. He knelt down, looked around like a common thief, and screwed a metal sign in my handrail that read in quote, "Property of Blackwood HOA. Emergency access only, unauthorized use prohibited." End quote. They were literally trying to fabricate evidence of ownership in the middle of the night, thinking I was just some mountain hermit who wooed into Oppos. T noticed a new sign on his own damn bridge. I didn't in Oppos. T tear the sign down. Instead, I drove straight to the sheriff's office with a thumb drive full of footage and a folder of maps that would make a surveyor weep. Deputy Miller, who's known me since I was a kid, watched the video 3 times, shaking his head the whole time, and told me that while the HOA has a lot of power, they don't in Oppos. T have the power to commit criminal mischief and trespassing. I filed a formal complaint right then and there, but I knew the sheriff's office moved slow, so I called an old friend of mine named Miller, a guy who spent 20 years as a structural engineer for the state, and asked him to come out for a, end quote, consultation. End quote. He showed up on Friday with a clipboard and a level, spent 3 hours crawling under the span, and gave me a notarized affidavit certifying that the bridge was a private build, funded by private capital, and maintained solely by the landowner with no external oversight. I sent a copy of that report along with a cease and desist letter to the HOA office via certified mail. And for about a week, I thought maybe they backed off, but then I got a thick packet from a guy named Marcus Sterling, the HOA's, end quote, legal affairs liaison, end quote. The tone had shifted from, end quote, please contribute, end quote, to, end quote, we are taking your house, end quote. They were now accusing me of, end quote, willful obstruction of public safety, end quote, and, end quote, endangering the community, end quote, claiming that by refusing to acknowledge their ownership, I was preventing emergency vehicles from reaching the backwoods. They threatened a lien on my cabin, a fine of $500 a day, and a, end quote, mandatory restoration fee, end quote, to bring the bridge up to their arbitrary standards. I called my sister, Sarah, who's an attorney over in the city and has a personality like a serrated knife, and she told me this wasn't an Oppos. T just a dispute anymore. It was civil fraud and attempted land encroachment. End quote. They're desperate, Silas, end quote. She told me over the phone, end quote. They've probably been skimming from the maintenance fund for years, and they need a big in Oppos, infrastructure win in Oppos, to show the auditors why the money is gone. End quote. She told me to start talking to my neighbors, the ones who lived on the actual roads, and that's when the real rot started to show. I found an elderly couple 3 miles down the road who had been billed $4,000 for a, end quote, communal well, end quote, that was never dug, and a young family who was being fined for the color of their curtains while the HOA-managed playground was literally rusting into the dirt. Evelyn wasn't in Oppos. T just coming from my bridge. She was running a predatory fiefdom, using the threat of liens to keep everyone too scared to look at the books. The breaking point came on a Saturday morning when I saw Evelyn herself, standing on the edge of my property with 2 guys in suits, pointing at my bridge and taking notes like she already owned the place. I walked down there, leaning on a fence post with my phone recording in my pocket, and asked her if she'd lost her way to the golf course. She turned around with that icy, superior look and told me they were conducting a, end quote, pre-acquisition inspection, end quote, for the safety of the estates. I told her they were trespassing on private land and that those men better be ready to show their surveyor licenses, because I'd already talked to the county and there was no record of an easement. One of the suits looked nervous and asked if I was the owner, and I just smiled and said, end quote, I'm the guy who's going to make sure you never work in this county again if you step 1 foot on that wood. End quote. Evelyn's face turned a shade of purple I've never seen in nature, and she hissed at me that I was, end quote, destroying the harmony of the community, end quote, but she retreated back to her SUV. That night, I sent everything. The night vision footage of the sign installation, the forged maps, the engineering reports, and the testimonials from the neighbors, to the state's attorney's office and the local news stations, end quote, on your side, end quote, segment. A week later, the subpoenas started flying like confetti, and the county sheriff showed up at the HOA office with a warrant to seize their hard drives. It turned out my sister was right. The, end quote, infrastructure and compliance division, end quote, was a shell company Evelyn and Marcus had set up to funnel in quote, maintenance fees and quote, into a private account that had been paying for their personal vacations and a very expensive remodel of Evelyn's kitchen. By the time the emergency town council meeting was called, the parking lot was so packed that people were parking in the ditches for half a mile. I walked in with my manila folder, feeling a weird mix of exhaustion and adrenaline, and watched as Evelyn sat at the front table looking like a ghost of herself. The mayor called for citizen reports, and I didn't in oppos. T just talked about my bridge. I talked about the fraud, the midnight sign hanging, and the way they try to use fear to steal a man's hard work. One by one, other neighbors stood up, people who had been quiet for years, and started throwing their own bills on the table, demanding to know where the money for the end quote, wildfire mitigation end quote, and the end quote, paving projects end quote, had actually gone. The room erupted into a chaos that even the mayor's gavel couldn't and oppos. T stop, and right there in the middle of it, two investigators from the Financial Crimes Unit walked in and asked Evelyn to step into the hallway. She tried to maintain her dignity, straightening her sweater vest and claiming it was all a end quote, clerical misunderstanding end quote, but the evidence was too heavy. They'd found the digital trail where they'd attempted to doctor the parcel maps to make my bridge look like it was on communal land, and that was the nail in the coffin. The HOA board was dissolved by the end of the month, and a temporary receiver was appointed to untangle the mess of hundreds of thousands of dollars in missing funds. Zelda, or Evelyn, whatever you want to call her, ended up taking a plea deal that involved a lot of restitution and a very long period of house arrest, though, ironically, she can't even see my bridge from her house. The community restructured into a voluntary association with zero power to issue fines or liens, and the new bylaws are only 5 pages long, mostly focusing on who's bringing the potato salad to the summer potluck. My bridge is still there, holding steady against the spring floods, and the only sign on it now is a small steel plate I welded myself that says, in quote, private property, built with sweat, not fines, in quote. Sometimes I sit on my porch and watch the new neighbors walk by on the trail near the creek, and they'll wave and admire the craftsmanship of the span. They don an oppos. T have to pay a toll, and I don an oppos. T send them an invoice, because that's what a real community looks like. People respecting each other's boundaries and appreciating the work they do. But I still keep the trail cam active, just in case someone else gets the bright idea that my work belongs to them. It makes me wonder, though, how many other people are sitting in their homes right now, staring at a bill from some power-tripping board, wondering if they have the strength to fight back. Is an HOA ever really about the, end quote, community, end quote, or is it just a way for people with too much time and a thirst for power to play king of the hill at your expense? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments. Have you ever had a fight a, end quote, phantom, end quote, fee, or did you just pay to keep the peace? Because let me tell you, the peace is a lot sweeter when you've earned it by standing your ground.